Marissa Collins stood in the center of the crowded courtroom, her heart steady despite the nervousness trying to creep in. It wasn't her first run-in with the law, but this was different. This time, the stakes felt higher. She could almost hear the thrum of the air around her, the judgment in the air. Her calm demeanor and quiet resolve were her armor, though. She had been prepared for this. Judge Thomas Ellis, seated high above her, flipped through the papers on his desk, eyes scanning the details of her case. His gavel tapped the wood 3 times, a signal for the courtroom to settle into silence. The judge had a reputation for being strict, his decisions swift and uncompromising. Marissa wasn't sure if he had even looked up from the paperwork as he spoke. Marissa Collins, you have been charged with obstructing an officer during a protest, a misdemeanor offense. The law is clear, and your actions, as reported, seem to have interfered with police duties, Judge Ellis declared, his voice firm. He glanced up at her for the first time, his gaze cold and distant, as though this was just another case in a long string of similar ones. Marissa stood tall, her eyes focused on the judge, but her mind wandered briefly to the protest itself. The crowd, the signs, the chants calling for justice. They had only gathered to voice their concerns about police misconduct, a topic that had become painfully familiar in her own life. She had watched her brother fall victim to excessive force by officers in a situation that had gone viral, sparking her determination to fight for change. She wasn't just another protester. She was a woman on a mission, a woman who had spent years studying the system and learning how to transform it from within. I wasn't obstructing, Marissa replied calmly, her voice steady, almost too measured. I was exercising my right to protest peacefully. The real obstruction is the system that fails to hold officers accountable for their actions. I want to see justice, not punishment. Judge Ellis didn't flinch at her words, but his lips tightened as he scanned the evidence in front of him. He had seen cases like this before, activists standing up for what they believed in, often with little regard for the law. He didn't understand the bigger picture, the way the protest had been a plea for systemic reform. He saw only the charge, and that was enough for him to pass judgment. You are being fined $500, he declared. The court will not tolerate obstruction in the execution of law enforcement duties. You will pay the fine within 30 days, or face further consequences. Marissa's heart sank, but she didn't let it show. She knew the battle was far from over. This was just one moment, one tiny hurdle in a much larger fight. As she turned to leave the courtroom, her eyes briefly met those of Judge Ellis. For a split second, there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Was it doubt? Regret? She couldn't tell, but she knew one thing for sure. This was far from the last time their paths would cross. As Marissa walked out of the courtroom, a quiet storm began to stir within her. Marissa Collins left the courthouse, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The weight of the fine still hung heavily on her shoulders, but it was the system itself that weighed most on her heart. The courtroom incident, though small in the grand scheme of things, was just another example of how the law could be used to silence those seeking change. But Marissa wasn't easily silenced. In fact, the fine felt like a badge of honor, a sign that her work was beginning to matter. As she exited the building, she checked her phone. There were several notifications. News outlets had picked up the story of her case, and social media was already buzzing with comments. Most were supportive, but some were dismissive. The familiar criticism of radical voices echoed from the digital crowd. Marissa scrolled through the messages, her lips curling into a slight smile. The media frenzy, though predictable, couldn't shake her resolve. It was only a matter of time before the public would understand what she was fighting for. And when that time came, she would be ready. Later that evening, Marissa sat at her kitchen table in her modest apartment, surrounded by stacks of papers, legal texts, and her laptop. She took a deep breath and focused. The room was silent except for the soft clicking of her keys. She had been working for years on something far more significant than any protest or court case. She was writing a new framework for federal policing standards, a set of guidelines that aimed to overhaul how law enforcement handled cases of racial profiling, use of force, and accountability. Her proposal wasn't a small change. It was a radical shift in how the country approached policing. It aimed to bring transparency to the systems that had long operated in secrecy, ensuring that police officers were held accountable not just by their departments, but by the communities they served. It was a vision for a future where bias was eradicated from law enforcement, where trust between officers and civilians wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. Her proposal had already caught the attention of a few influential figures within Congress. She had spent months refining it, working with a network of criminologists, civil rights leaders, and former law enforcement officers to craft a plan that was both feasible and powerful. Marissa knew it wasn't going to be easy. The system was entrenched, and reforming it would be like trying to move a mountain with her bare hands. But she had no intention of backing down. Marissa paused and looked at the drafts scattered before her. This was her life's work, and she knew that despite the hurdles, despite the pushback, she was on the verge of something monumental. With one final keystroke, she saved her latest version, sending it off to her team. The quiet revolution was gaining momentum. And as she closed her laptop, Marissa couldn't help but wonder, would Judge Ellis ever realize the magnitude of the woman he'd just found? In the days following the courtroom, Marissa's name became synonymous with the cause she championed. Her court case, once seen as a minor incident, rapidly gained national attention. News outlets began to report on her background, her history as an activist, her advocacy for police reform, and her recent involvement in drafting a set of revolutionary federal policing standards. What was once a single headline buried in local news became a story covered by major news channels, with interviews, op-eds, and even political discussions. Marissa's image appeared everywhere, in articles, on TV screens, and across social media. To some, she was a hero, a symbol of the fight for justice. To others, she was a threat to the status quo, a radical who needed to be silenced. The conversations surrounding her grew heated, with some calling for her to be banned from speaking at public events, while others rallied around her, applauding her for speaking out. For Marissa, it was overwhelming. She had never set out to be famous. She was an advocate first and foremost, driven by a singular purpose, reforming the system that had too long failed the people it was meant to serve. But now, her name was everywhere, and the pressure of public scrutiny was undeniable. She couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. People stopped her in the streets, asking for her opinion or expressing their support. Though it was validating, it was also exhausting. Meanwhile, Judge Ellis sat at his desk, surrounded by piles of legal paperwork, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman he had sentenced just days earlier. He couldn't escape the image of Marissa's calm, unwavering expression as she stood before him in court. There was something about her that nagged at him. He had handed down a sentence, but it felt like there was more to her story, something he had missed in the rush of his decision. It wasn't long before Ellis began following the media coverage surrounding her. He read about her work in criminal justice reform, about her leadership in developing new policing standards that were now being considered by lawmakers. She wasn't just an activist. She was an expert, a strategist working behind the scenes to reshape national policy. Marissa had quietly become one of the most influential voices in the country on the subject of policing. Judge Ellis couldn't help but feel a growing sense of discomfort. How had he missed this? How had he failed to see that the woman he had found was at the forefront of something monumental? His initial dismissal of her had been swift, based on assumptions that now seemed grossly oversimplified. The more he learned about her work, the more his perception of the case began to shift. She wasn't just another protester. She was creating a blueprint for the future of policing in America. The more Ellis thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't ignore the larger implications of his decision. This case, this woman, had shaken something inside him. But what was he supposed to do about it now? Judge Ellis spent the next few days in a quiet turmoil, his usual routine disrupted by a growing sense of unease. He found himself waking up early, staring at the headlines that featured Marissa Collins, wondering how he had missed something so significant. He knew the world of law enforcement was complex, but he hadn't fully understood just how deep the waters ran. His thoughts returned repeatedly to her calm voice in the courtroom, her words about justice and accountability. Could it be that he had judged her too quickly, without grasping the full scope of her influence? The more Ellis delved into Marissa's work, the more fascinated he became. He researched the federal policing standards she had developed, learning about her team of criminologists, legal experts, and former law enforcement officers who had come together to build a comprehensive set of guidelines for reform. He was shocked to find that her proposals weren't just theoretical ideas, but had already begun to gain traction in some local police departments, where the leadership had begun testing new methods to reduce bias and improve transparency. Even more surprising was the recognition she was receiving in Washington, D.C., where her proposals were being taken seriously by lawmakers. What troubled Ellis the most was how, despite all her success, Marissa had remained so composed and humble. She wasn't out to claim the spotlight or fame. She wasn't playing the media game. She was focused on one thing: real, tangible change in the way policing was carried out in America. As Ellis continued to read her interviews and study her proposals, he began to question his assumptions. Had he dismissed her because of her appearance, her activism, her approach to the system, or had he simply not recognized her importance in the moment? The more he thought about it, the more Ellis realized that he had underestimated her. Marissa wasn't just another person caught in the gears of a broken system. She was someone who had learned how to maneuver those gears and turn them in a different direction. He wondered if he, too, was a part of that system, unwittingly contributing to its failures. His role in sentencing her had seemed like an isolated act, but now it felt much larger. It felt like a small cog in a machine that he had never really questioned. After several days of reflection, Ellis found himself at a crossroads. He could continue to let his initial judgment stand, ignoring the growing awareness that Marissa's work was much more important than her misdemeanor charge. Or he could reach out, try to understand her, and perhaps even learn something from the very person he had once dismissed. The decision, for the first time in his career, didn't seem as simple as the law. It was about something deeper, about the kind of justice he truly believed in. Judge Ellis sat in his office, staring at the phone in his hand. He had drafted and erased several messages to Marissa Collins over the past few days. He had thought about reaching out, but each time, the words seemed inadequate. What could he say to someone whose life's work he had so blatantly misunderstood? But something inside him urged him to try, to at least open a dialogue. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about understanding. Understanding her, her work, and perhaps, in the process, understanding himself. Finally, he composed a simple message. "Miss Collins, I would like to meet with you to discuss your work and the recent case. Please let me know if you're available." With a breath, he hit send. The reply came swiftly. "Judge Ellis, unwilling to meet, but I'm sure you understand if I'm cautious about our conversation. Let's keep it respectful." He could sense the guarded tone, but at least she agreed to meet. They arranged to meet the following day at a cafe near her apartment. When the day arrived, Judge Ellis stood in front of the cafe, taking a deep breath before walking in. Marissa was already seated at a table in a corner, a laptop open in front of her, papers neatly stacked beside her. She looked up when he approached, her expression neutral but not unkind. She motioned to the empty chair across from her. "I assume this isn't just about the fine," she said, her voice steady but sharp. Ellis hesitated, then sat down. "No, it's not. I've been looking into your work. I've read about the reforms you're pushing for, and I've been reflecting on what happened in the courtroom. I think I owe you an explanation." Marissa raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, allowing him to continue. Ellis paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't understand the full picture when I sentenced you. I thought you were just another protester, but your work is much more than that. It's important. It's changing things, and I failed to see that." Marissa didn't respond immediately. She studied him, her expression unreadable. "I don't need an apology, Judge," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But I do want you to understand that the work I'm doing isn't just about protest. It's about saving lives, about creating a system where people can trust law enforcement again, where communities and officers can work together. It's hard, but it's necessary." Ellis nodded, his mind processing her words. He had always believed in the idea of justice, but he had never truly questioned whether the system he had worked in for so long was part of the problem. It was uncomfortable, but the more he listened to Marissa, the clearer it became. Her vision was one of real systemic change. "Tell me more," he said, his voice quieter now. "I want to understand." Over the next few weeks, Judge Ellis and Marissa met several more times. Their meetings weren't about the case anymore. They were about something deeper, something that Ellis hadn't fully understood until now. At first, the conversations were tense, with Ellis trying to catch up to Marissa's deep well of knowledge and experience. But slowly, the tension began to dissolve, replaced by a growing mutual respect. Marissa was patient, explaining the details of her proposed reforms and the years of work she had invested in crafting her vision for federal policing standards. Ellis found himself captivated by her dedication. She didn't just talk about the flaws in the system. She had spent years creating a blueprint for how to fix them. Her proposals were thoughtful, well-researched, and most importantly, grounded in real-world experience. She wasn't talking in abstract terms. She was offering concrete solutions for the issues that had plagued law enforcement for generations. And though Ellis had been a part of the very system she sought to change, her arguments weren't lost on him. Each discussion forced him to reckon with his own complicity in a system that had long failed to hold police officers accountable. Marissa was blunt about the failures she had seen firsthand: the systemic racism, the lack of accountability, the abuse of power that seemed to go unchecked. "It's not about individual officers," she said during one of their meetings. "It's about a culture that needs to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. And we're starting with policy that holds law enforcement to the same standards as the communities they serve." Ellis nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. His job as a judge had often felt like enforcing the status quo, simply applying the law as it was. But now, after hearing Marissa's perspective, he began to see his role differently. He wasn't just an observer of the law. He was a participant in a system that needed to evolve. And it wasn't enough to passively preside over cases. He had to question the laws themselves, the very foundation they were built on. It wasn't an easy realization. Ellis had spent his entire career within the system, assuming that what he did was enough. But the more he listened to Marissa, the more he realized that the system itself needed to change. And if he was truly committed to justice, then he had a responsibility to help lead that change. One evening, as they were wrapping up a particularly intense conversation, Ellis looked at Marissa and said, "I can't keep pretending that the way things are is enough. You're right. We need to do more. I'm going to look for ways to incorporate your ideas into my rulings. I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out." Marissa's eyes softened, and for the first time, he saw a glimpse of something personal behind her professional exterior. "Hope." She nodded. "That's all we can ask for, Judge. A willingness to change." And in that moment, Ellis knew that he was no longer just a judge who handed down sentences. He was beginning to see the possibility of real transformation, one that would extend far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Judge Ellis's decision to start embracing the idea of reform wasn't just a personal revelation. It began to have tangible effects. Over the next several months, he became more involved in conversations about police reform, using his platform and his influence in the judiciary to advocate for changes he had once thought impossible. His courtroom decisions began to reflect his evolving perspective. He became known for making rulings that encouraged transparency and accountability, especially in cases involving police conduct. When he was faced with cases of alleged police misconduct, he approached them with a deeper understanding of the systemic issues at play, often requiring officers to undergo additional training or even revisiting cases where excessive force had been used. As word spread about Ellis's shift in perspective, he received both praise and criticism. Some saw him as a trailblazer, a judge willing to challenge the system for the sake of justice. Others, particularly those who had long benefited from the status quo, labeled him as soft on crime, accusing him of undermining the authority of law enforcement. But Ellis was undeterred. He had come to understand that the law wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about ensuring fairness and equity for everyone, regardless of race, background, or status. Marissa, meanwhile, was gaining traction in her efforts to influence national policy. Her framework for police reform had become a key talking point in Washington, D.C., where discussions about overhauling the criminal justice system were intensifying. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle began taking her proposals seriously, and several police departments around the country started adopting some of her recommendations. Though it was slow progress, there were signs that change was on the horizon. In private moments, Marissa reflected on how much had shifted since her encounter with Judge Ellis. At first, she had seen him as just another symbol of the system that needed to be torn down, another judge who would deliver a fine and dismiss her work as insignificant. But now she saw him as an ally in the fight for justice, someone who was willing to listen, learn, and evolve. Their meetings had become more than just exchanges of ideas. They were conversations between two people who, despite their differences, were united by a shared goal, a more just and equitable society. Then, one day, Judge Ellis invited Marissa to a public event, a conference on police reform being held in D.C., where she was to be one of the key speakers. It was a significant moment for both of them. For Marissa, it was an opportunity to present her vision to a broader audience, and for Ellis, it was a chance to show the world how a judge could evolve, challenge his own biases, and support change. When Marissa took the stage to speak, she glanced at Ellis in the crowd. He gave her an encouraging nod. And in that moment, she knew that their collaboration was just the beginning. The ripple effect of their work together was only starting to unfold. The conference in Washington, D.C. was a pivotal moment for both Marissa and Judge Ellis. As Marissa took the stage, the weight of her work and the responsibility of the moment settled on her shoulders. The room was filled with lawmakers, civil rights leaders, police officials, and activists, all gathered to discuss the future of policing in America. She had been invited to speak as one of the leading voices in the call for reform. But for Marissa, the real change was happening not just in the speeches or the media coverage. It was in the quiet conversations happening behind the scenes, in the allies she had gained, and in the influence she was starting to wield. As Marissa spoke passionately about her framework for reform, her words resonated deeply with the audience. She outlined the need for national standards on police accountability, emphasizing the importance of transparency, better training, and policies that could hold officers accountable for their actions. Her words were met with applause, but what really mattered was that the ideas she had fought for so long were being heard. For the first time, it felt like the country was ready to listen, ready to change. Judge Ellis, seated in the front row, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The man who had once sentenced Marissa for her activism now found himself an advocate for her cause. The conversation they had started months ago in a small cafe had blossomed into something larger than either of them had imagined. Watching her speak, he realized how much he had grown, not just as a judge, but as a person. His role had shifted from a passive observer of the law to someone actively engaged in shaping it. After her speech, Marissa took a seat beside him, her face glowing with the energy of the moment. She smiled at him, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared journey. "I never imagined we'd be here," she said, her voice soft but confident. Ellis chuckled. "Neither did I. But I think we're just getting started." Their relationship had become something more than just a partnership between an activist and a judge. It was a symbol of what could happen when individuals on opposite sides of the system came together to question and ultimately transform it. Over the months that followed, they continued to work closely, with Ellis using his position to support the reforms Marissa had set in motion. His rulings in cases involving police misconduct increasingly aligned with her vision, and he began advising lawmakers on the practical implications of the changes she had proposed. For Marissa, it was validation. She had always known that reform was possible, but seeing it unfold in real time, with a judge like Ellis standing beside her, gave her hope. Together, they were proving that even the most entrenched systems could evolve, that justice wasn't a fixed concept, but a living, breathing force that could be shaped by those who fought for it. As they left the conference together, Marissa and Ellis shared a quiet moment of reflection. They both knew that the work wasn't over. That change was a long and ongoing process. But for the first time, they were certain of one thing. They were on the right side of history, and together, they would continue to push for a future where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality for everyone.